Hello and welcome back to the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group's UCMC podcast, where our analysts convene to delve into the realms of Russian disinformation, propaganda, and the influence of hybrid warfare into 2024. So today's topic is going to be about Syria. Lots has happened over the past month. The rapid collapse of Assad's regime in Syria, and it has dealt quite a major blow to Russia's influence in the Middle East, with rebel forces seizing Damascus and Assad fleeing to Russia for asylum. The failure of Moscow to prevent this outcome has exposed the limits of its global ambitions, especially as its focus remains on Ukraine. Despite the Kremlin's claims of achieving its primary goals in Syria, the loss of a key ally and the evacuation of its military assets undermines Russia's power projection in the region. And domestically, the fallout has sparked some criticism of Russia's foreign policy, further highlighting the strategic and symbolic embarrassment for Moscow on the global stage. We've got here with us on the show, as always, guys, our analysts, Tori and Volodymyr. I'm going to start straight with Tori. Tori, by whom, which regional forces and maybe the former regime has Russia shifted the responsibility for the collapse of the Assad regime? Because we've seen a lot about their change of narratives. At the beginning, they were naming the rebel forces, oppositionists as terrorists, and now they've changed it to the opposition and potential government. So what have you seen? Where has the responsibility been shifted to?
Hi, Matt. Thank you for the question. It's obviously like everyone, but not Russia. There is like classics with the US is at fault, and Europe is at fault, simply being like it's their ambition, it's their imperial regimes and not ours. We are not the empire, they are, which is like pretty classic at this point, because they use this narrative with like after the accusation of the hybrid warfare usage in the election in Moldova, Georgia, now in Romania. So there was also a narrative of how it's not actually a rebellion, or it's not like the opposition forces. It's basically other countries having a war and dividing Syria between themselves. For example, they're talking about how Syria is not free. In fact, it's like Israeli and Turkey having a war on its territory, and all the proclamations of freedom of Syria being just a lie to cover it up, or being like something like Syrians did not understand it yet, but well, in fact, this is what's happening and they're in for another war. There is also some victim blaming rhetorics of how Syrians exchanged a leader who was not perfect, and yeah, his regime was violent, but in reality, the so-called opposition will be worse. They're like also pushing this narrative of how now they will see the true suffering, and no one will come and help them because Russia is like no longer interested. Also, one of the narratives was about how, in fact, it's not Russia's fault, of course, but this situation is actually working in Russia's favor. In a way, a continuation of a narrative of how Syria is now a place of war between Israeli and Turkey, with it continuing in a way of how it works in Russia's favor because it gives them a precedent, and in fact, it justifies the war in Ukraine that Russia has started. So, yeah, and there was a bit of a criticism. It was mostly about how, once again, Russia has been kind and benevolent, when in reality it should have done what it was doing so well in the past, being an empire, and should not have even allowed the thoughts of someone coming to that territory and taking it back. And of course, they did drag Ukraine into it because, of course, in some of the narrative, Ukraine was giving military aid to Syrian opposition, or Ukraine was, in fact, teaching them, or how it was all actually Ukrainians coming to Syria. Those narratives weren't specifically popular. It was mostly more popular was a narrative with the how US is at fault and Israeli and Turkey is at fault. Also, if we're talking about dragging in Ukraine, a bit of it was also about how Russian so-called expert politologists were trying to measure if Syria is more important than Ukraine, which military success would be more important. Maybe Syria is like not that important, etc., etc. This is basically a rundown of the narrative Russia is using around their loss in Syria.
And Volodymyr, to bring you into the conversation today, what I want to focus on with you is more the military side of it. Obviously, we know this is a huge loss for the Russian military if they are, in fact, going to lose their military bases in Syria. There has been lots of talk so far in Western press as well that there are conversations which are quite far along that Russia can remain its military presence and military bases in the country. And even Putin today, in his conversation with the people, he said that it's looking likely that they could, but Russia has to decide whether it's beneficial for Russia to stay in Syria or not, which obviously it is. But what, in your opinion, do you think is going to be the format Russia will use to maintain its presence in Syria? Will it?
Thanks, Matt. It's a great question. So, at first, Syria is the pillar of Russia's presence, geopolitical presence in not only at the Eastern Mediterranean, but also globally, because it is the bases in Syria are a focal point of their logistics towards Africa and many other regions globally. So the loss of these facilities in Syria, of Tartus and air base will cost much for Putin's regime. And that means that Moscow is losing its credibilities. But the situation is still quite misty. And here I'd like to remind the statement of the leader of the main force in Syria nowadays, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Abu Mahmed al-Julani. So he said that the new leadership of Syria has given Russia the opportunity to build new relations. For me, this statement is more about their ambition to achieve investments into the ruined economy of Syria. But from the point of a former story of relations between Assad regime and Russia, we see that Kremlin's regime does not obtain enough capabilities in economic terms. Just according to the official numbers, the turnover between Syria and Russia did not reach more than $500 million per year during the last years, and that means that it is completely not enough. So I think that projects which was guided by Russia's corporations like Rostech, Kamaz, Rosatom, they will be rejected by the new government, especially under pressure of European Union. Because, as we know, the main leaders of European Union made statements that if the new government of Syria seek investments from European countries and rely on the possible programs of integration of Syrians which fled to European countries, that is possible only if Russia will be wiped out literally from its bases in Syria. So what we're witnessing now, I think most evidences tell us about Russian withdrawal during next weeks or months. And obviously it is a great loss for Russia and personally for Putin because his propaganda invested a lot into so-called Russian successes in Syria.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr and Tori. We will be keeping an eye on how this develops over the next coming weeks. and we will definitely be writing more material or another podcast based on this topic. So do keep your eyes out. Thank you very much, guys, for listening, and speak to you soon.